And now, Judith Brown-Dianis.
Tonight we are here to consider whether President George W. Bush should be held accountable for the tragedies that resulted from inept and insufficient responses to Hurricane Katrina, and whether the president should in fact be impeached for these offenses. Impeachment is the only constitutional method to protect Americans from a president intent on abusing power, violating the Constitution, violating the laws, and breaching public trust. President Bush acted with reckless indifference in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, depriving thousands of people in Louisiana, Mississippi, and other Gulf states of urgently needed support, causing mass suffering and unnecessary loss of life. He was the commander-in-chief, the person with the sole responsibility to mobilize and marshal federal resources. He failed. He appointed disaster officials who were hapless. President Bush failed to take care to faithfully execute the laws, violated the public trust, and demonstrated reckless and inexcusable indifference to human life before and during Hurricane Katrina. Secondly, President Bush and his administration continue to demonstrate reckless and inexcusable indifference to the lives of Hurricane Katrina survivors in violation of human rights standards. He did not preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. The President of the United States has ultimate responsibility and authority to issue emergency orders to mobilize the military and any federal resources needed to aid and assist in a disaster, according to the Federal Stafford Act.
The Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act authorizes the President to issue a major disaster declaration to speed a wide range of federal aid to states determined to be overwhelmed by hurricanes or other catastrophes.
Financing for the aid is appropriated to the Disaster Relief Fund, administered by the Department of Homeland Security.
The Stafford Act authorizes temporary housing, grants for immediate needs of families and individuals, the repair of public infrastructure, emergency communication systems, and other forms of assistance.
The Stafford Act provides the President with permanent authority to direct federal aid to stricken states.
President George W. Bush himself had it right when he spoke to the American people on September 16, 2005, in Jackson Square in New Orleans.
4 years after the frightening experience of September 11th, Americans have every right to expect a more effective response in a time of emergency. When the federal government fails to meet such an obligation, I, as President, am responsible for the problem and for the solution.
We will begin by looking at preparation for the storm. Much has been made of the failure of the levees that were supposed to protect the city of New Orleans from devastating flooding, as well as questions of on whose shoulders responsibility for the failures lie, and whether the magnitude of the storm was properly understood before it hit. The overwhelming evidence shows that the storm was well understood by government authorities at the local, state, and federal level, including by the President, who we have already seen carried the ultimate responsibility for these matters. On August 28, 2005, prior to Hurricane Katrina making landfall, there was a video conference briefing between President Bush, FEMA, Homeland Security, and Gulf Coast state and local authorities. National Hurricane Center Director Max Mayfield made it very clear that the levees in New Orleans were in danger of not holding up against the storm.
You know, it's a very complex system of levees there in New Orleans area. The big question is going to be, will the storm top some of the levees? I do expect there will be some of the levees overtopped.
Despite the fact that President Bush was part of that briefing, in a September 1st, 2005 interview with Diane Sawyer, President Bush stated,
I don't think anybody anticipated the breach of the levees. They did anticipate a serious storm, but these levees got breached.
It's clear that there was a failure of the levee system that was supposed to protect New Orleans, and we are going to look briefly at the reasons for the failure. responsibility for which, we will show, can be traced directly to the federal government under the leadership of President George W. Bush. Let's hear from the Government Accountability Office testimony to the U.S. Senate.
Congress first authorized the Louisiana Hurricane Protection Project in the Flood Control Act of 1965 to provide hurricane protection to areas around Lake Pontchartrain. The project was federally authorized when Hurricane Katrina struck. The project, including about 125 miles of levees, was still estimated to be from 60 to 90% complete. The Corps' project fact sheet from May 2005 noted that the President's budget requests for fiscal years 2005 and 2006 were insufficient to find new construction contracts.
Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. In the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, it became apparent that the federal government had failed utterly in reacting to the crisis facing the people of the Gulf Coast. Federal flood control spending was reduced by nearly half from 2001 to 2005. The Army Corps of Engineers budget for federal hurricane protection was also slashed, despite increased requests from funds from Louisiana Senator Mary Landrieu. According to Eric Tolbert, a former FEMA Response Division Director under the Bush administration,
The War on Terror and the creation of the Department of Homeland Security diverted funds from FEMA's disaster planning.